On the 17th of October, 1997, a quiet, anonymous tip would permanently alter the peaceful town of Oakridge, nestled in the heart of Oregon. Sheriff Thomas Wilkins received the call. The complaint, from a neighbor who wished to stay unnamed, reported unusual noises coming from a secluded property that had belonged to the Blackwood family since the middle of the 19th century. "There is something wrong in that barn. I have never seen anyone come in or out, but at night sometimes I hear shouts. They are not animals," said the recorded call, which remains preserved in the Lane County Police Archives. What the authorities discovered at the Blackwood Farm, located roughly 40 kilometers from Oakridge Center, was beyond anything they could have imagined. Concealed by thick vegetation and encircled by a barbed wire fence nearly 3 meters high, stood a faded red barn. It looked ordinary from a distance, but its single entrance was sealed shut with multiple chains, locks, and padlocks. When the officers forced the door open, the smell assaulted them first, a foul combination of urine, feces, and something one officer would later call the scent of pure human absence. Inside, dimly lit by cracks in the roof, they found 7 women, ranging in age from 12 to 42, living in conditions the police report would later call incompatible with any standard of human dignity. "I swear," Dr. Michael Stevenson, the coroner on the scene, told the Portland Herald, "in 27 years of medicine, I have never witnessed anything like this." Those women had physical traits that immediately pointed to severe consanguinity and prolonged inbreeding, facial malformations, extra digits, obvious vision issues. But the most haunting thing was their eyes. Every one of them had the exact same, empty stare. Later investigations would show the barn was not just a prison for victims, but the site of a generational experiment in family endogamy that spanned at least 5 generations. Genetic data collected at the University of Oregon confirmed these were likely the most inbred women ever documented in modern American history. The property was officially owned by Jeremiah Blackwood, then 68, the patriarch of a family that had grown increasingly isolated from the community over decades. What began as simple social withdrawal had morphed into one of the most disturbing chronicles of abuse, isolation, and intentional genetic manipulation ever recorded. The initial probe revealed that 4 of the 7 women were Jeremiah's biological daughters, while the other 3 were the results of unions between his own children and daughters over the years. Their coefficient of inbreeding, as later calculated by geneticists at the University of Washington, reached values nearing 0.375, numbers almost never seen outside of extremely isolated populations. "This wasn't a case of ignorance or an accident," explained Dr. Eliza Montgomery, the forensic geneticist leading the case. "We discovered detailed diaries that show a clear, deliberate intention to create what they called a pure lineage. There were notes on specific physical traits, attempts to select for things like eye color and bone structure through planned pairings between close relatives." The Blackwood case didn't just shock the small local community, it reignited debates on rural isolation, community vigilance, and the limits of family privacy in America's remote regions. The family's history traces back to the Great Depression when Elijah Blackwood, Jeremiah's grandfather, bought the 200-acre property in 1931 for a fraction of its worth. Original Lane County records show Elijah, a former miner who lost everything in the crash, paid only $175 for the land, a price considered extremely low even for that time. According to local historical archives, the reason for the discount was the property's sinister reputation. In 1924, the previous owner, John Wickman, had murdered his entire family before killing himself. Since then, no one had wanted the land. This event, though seemingly separate from the Blackwood story, established a pattern of isolation and superstition that would shape the family's destiny. Elijah Blackwood arrived with his wife Martha and their 5 children. Preserved school records in the Oakridge Library show the children attended the local school for only a year before being pulled out for homeschooling. An official dismissal document from 1933 includes an observation from the principal of the era: "Family displays extreme, withdrawn behavior. Children show age-appropriate knowledge but avoid interaction with other students." The family rarely visited town, making just 2 or 3 trips a year for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. A diary kept by the local store owner between 1935 and 1940, now at the Oakridge Historical Museum, notes, "The Blackwoods came today. As usual, The children and Mrs. B stayed in the car while the old man shopped. No one in that family ever smiles. Bought unusually large amounts of kerosene and ammunition. Something about them isn't right. During World War II, when recruitment agents visited in 1943, they were met with armed resistance. Police records from the time indicate Elijah threatened the officers with a shotgun, declaring that no Blackwood will spill blood for a government that only remembers men when it needs them to die. For reasons not fully clear in the archives, the authorities decided not to press the issue. It was in this atmosphere of paranoia and isolation that Harold Blackwood, Elijah's middle son and Jeremiah's father, was raised. Documents found during the 1997 investigation reveal Harold married his own second cousin, Rebecca, from Idaho. The wedding was registered in Boise in 1952, but Rebecca was never seen by the Oakridge community. Harold just showed up one day with a wife, recalled Eleanor Wilson, then 93, a former local postal worker. "We never really saw her, you know? She was always in the car, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a veil, even in summer." Letters from her family in Idaho stopped arriving after a couple of years. Medical records recovered from the property indicate Rebecca gave birth to 6 children between 1953 and 1962, all at home without medical help. Of these, only 3 survived past childhood: Jeremiah, born 1956, Mary, 1958, and Joseph, 1961. The other 3 infants died from congenital issues, according to notes Harold kept in a notebook that served as an improvised family medical record. A disturbing entry from 1962 hints when the ideology of genetic isolation took a concrete form: Rebecca is too weak for more children. But we don't need outsiders. We have our own pure blood, strong as steel when kept unmixed. The weak die so the strong prosper. This is the law of nature that city men have forgotten. When Harold died in a tractor accident in 1978, Jeremiah, then 22, took control. Tax records show the family had expanded the main house and built 2 additional structures, one being the barn that would become the epicenter of the horror uncovered 2 decades later. The family's isolation intensified under Jeremiah's leadership. While his father had maintained minimal contact for essential supplies, Jeremiah reduced these interactions to almost zero. Records from a farm supply store show the last Blackwood purchase was in 1983, when Jeremiah bought vast quantities of seeds, tools, and building materials enough to support a long period of total isolation. Most disturbingly, diaries seized in 1997 showed a transition from simple social isolation to a deliberate project of genetic purification. Jeremiah, who had developed a self-taught interest in genetics from books found on the property, began systematically documenting family members' physical characteristics and planning unions between relatives. "The outside world corrupts the blood," he wrote in a 1985 entry. "Each generation that remains pure strengthens what we are. The weak will die, the strong will prosper. In 5 generations, we will have created something the world has never seen." The Red Barn, built in 1980 according to property records, was designed from the start not for agriculture, but as a prison. Hand-drawn plans by Jeremiah show a 2-story building with internal walls, a rudimentary water system, and, most disturbingly, an elaborate locking mechanism that could only be opened from the outside. The 7 women rescued in 1997 lived in what police described as medieval conditions. The ground floor had a common area with a long wooden table, benches, and a wood stove for minimal heat during Oregon's harsh winters. The second floor was divided into small cubicles serving as bedrooms, each with a straw mattress and a bucket for waste. There was no electricity. No proper plumbing, stated the Social Services report. Water came from a rainwater collection system. During droughts, Jeremiah or his brother Joseph would bring water from a nearby well. The barn's windows were nailed shut and boarded up, allowing only slivers of light through cracks and a few translucent roof panels. Psychologists who evaluated the victims later said this was a calculated method of causing temporal disorientation. The women had only a vague sense of time based on the limited natural light. The case grew even more chilling when Sarah, the eldest of the women at 42, began speaking to investigators. Sarah was identified as Jeremiah's biological daughter with his own sister, Mary. She had been the first confined to the barn at age 15. Daddy said we were special, that our blood was purer than any family in America, Sarah said in a recorded statement now part of an FBI case study. He had books on horse breeding. How breeders maintain pure strains. He said we were doing the same, only better. If you also feel the weight of this story, comment now. Purity does not justify the cruelty. According to the diaries and Sarah's testimony, the system was methodical. Women were moved to the barn upon reaching puberty. There, they were visited regularly by Jeremiah or Joseph in a rotation system documented in notebooks found in the main house. These visits led to frequent pregnancies, though many ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Weak babies did not survive, and this was seen as natural, even desirable, explained Dr. Robert Peterson, the forensic psychiatrist on the case. Male children who survived were taken to the main house to be raised, while girls remained in the barn with their mothers, perpetuating the cycle. The women's daily routine, as reconstructed by investigators, consisted mainly of sewing, preparing food, cleaning, and tending a small garden next to the barn where they could spend brief, supervised periods. This garden, ironically, was their only source of beauty. Several flower species grew among the vegetables, a surreal contrast to their dark existence. Makeshift medical records kept by Jeremiah revealed a clinical coldness. Each woman had a card detailing her physical traits, pregnancy history, and, most disturbingly, her reproductive value on a scale of 1 to 10. The food provided was surprisingly nutritious though monotonous, consisting mainly of homegrown vegetables, eggs, milk, and occasional meat. This wasn't a typical case of nutritional deprivation, said nutritionist Elizabeth Dawson in her report. On the contrary, there was an almost obsessive concern with certain nutrients. We found homemade herbal supplements apparently formulated to strengthen the blood, as described in Jeremiah's notebooks. Communication with the outside world was non-existent. The women had no access to radios, newspapers, or any information sources. Their knowledge was limited to what they learned from each other, and the few books allowed in the barn, mainly practical manuals on farming, home medicine, and, disturbingly, an altered Bible from which Jeremiah had removed passages and added his own texts. One of the most unsettling discoveries was the notebooks of Emma, the second oldest woman, then 37. Hidden under her mattress, they contained detailed drawings of the outside world as she imagined it, based on stories from older women and images in the few available books. Her drawings of modern cities resembled 19th-century illustrations, revealing their profound informational isolation. They developed their own communication system, explained Dr. Linda Morris, a linguist who analyzed their interactions. It wasn't a new language, but they used common words with specific meanings only they understood. For example, they called the sun the Watcher and had many different terms for the sounds the barn made during storms. When asked about resistance or escape, the women showed a conditioned fear response. "Where would we go?" asked Lily, then 23, during a therapy session. Daddy said the outside world was full of radiation, that people were sick and deformed. He said we were the only healthy ones, and one day when it was safe, we would leave and repopulate the earth. This apocalyptic mythology, crafted by Jeremiah over decades, incorporated distorted references to real events like the Chernobyl disaster and the AIDS epidemic, presented as signs of civilization's imminent collapse. Medical examinations at the University of Oregon Medical Center revealed the physical consequences of generations of inbreeding. A report later published anonymously in the American Journal of Medical Genetics detailed a series of conditions rarely seen in such concentration. The pattern of anomalies suggests severe, sustained consanguinity over multiple generations, wrote Dr. James Richardson, the lead geneticist. Among the most evident conditions were polydactyly, extra fingers or toes, in 5 of the women, severe dental malformations, and heterochromia, each eye a different color, a trait Jeremiah valued and tried to select for. More worrying were internal conditions. Imaging revealed heart malformations in all the women, ranging from mild defects to serious conditions like tetralogy of Fallot in 2 of them. The most severe case was Rose, 19, the medical report stated. She presented a combination of conditions we rarely see together: craniosynosis, a form of dwarfism, and a severe immune deficiency. One of the younger women, April, then 14, had an untreated metabolic disorder that caused irreversible neurological damage. The cognitive and psychological impact was equally profound. Neuropsychological tests showed 5 of the 7 women had some degree of intellectual disability, though it was hard to determine how much was genetic and how much was due to extreme deprivation. Sarah's case is particularly interesting, said neuropsychologist Dr. Patricia Winters. Despite the isolation, she demonstrates above-average cognitive ability. She taught herself to read from the available books and then taught the others. She developed a complex system for tracking time based on light patterns from the roof cracks. DNA tests confirmed what the physical symptoms suggested. The inbreeding coefficient in some of the younger women reached levels rarely seen in modern medicine. In simple terms, their DNA contains long segments that are identical on both chromosomes, explained Dr. Richardson. This only happens when both parents share very close common ancestors. Up to 37% of the genome in some of the younger women consisted of these identical segments. Perhaps the most disturbing find was the documentation in the main house. In a locked desk, investigators found dozens of notebooks where Jeremiah had meticulously documented his observations for decades. They revealed he was aware of the genetic risks but saw them as a necessary purification process. The first generations will suffer so that future ones can transcend, he wrote in 1992. This distortion of basic science to justify extreme abuse reflected a toxic mix of isolation, paranoia, and pathological narcissism, said Dr. Peterson. Among the books found were early 20th century eugenics texts, animal breeding manuals, and surprisingly, recent academic books on population genetics, suggesting Jeremiah occasionally obtained updated materials. On the morning of October 21, 1997, a new life began for the 7 women. After preliminary medical evaluations, they were transferred to a specialized facility in Portland, where a multidisciplinary team began one of the most complex rehabilitation processes ever documented in the United States. Jeremiah and Joseph Blackwood were arrested that same day. After psychiatric evaluations, both were deemed fit to stand trial. In September 1998, after a 3-week trial that attracted national attention, Jeremiah was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms with no possibility of parole for kidnapping, rape, incest, and child abuse. Joseph, whom prosecutors argued acted under his brother's psychological coercion, received a 45-year sentence. This is not just a case of extreme abuse, said Judge Elena Hayes during sentencing. It is a deliberate and systematic perversion of fundamental principles of humanity. Jeremiah remained impassive, refusing to recognize the court's legitimacy. His only statement revealed the depth of his distortion: "You are destroying what you don't understand." It was not a prison, it was a sanctuary. It was not cruelty, it was directed evolution. Joseph, however, showed signs of remorse, writing to the court, "I grew up believing the world was as Jeremiah said. It does not justify what I did, but perhaps it explains how a person can become an accomplice to such horror." The reintegration process for the 7 women was long and complex. The special program developed for them, later known as the Blackwood Protocol, became a model for victims of prolonged isolation. "We couldn't just throw them into the modern world," explained program coordinator Dr. Catherine Morris. "Everything from city noise to electricity was alien. We had to create a transitional environment." The case gained a new dimension in 2001 when Sarah Blackwood published her memoir with Dr. Morris's help. Born in Darkness, Memories of the Blackwood Barn became an instant bestseller and was later adapted into an award-winning HBO documentary. The proceeds were placed in a trust to support the survivors' continued care and education. "We are not just victims," Sarah wrote in her book's epilogue. "We are survivors, and now, finally, we are people entitled to our own futures." The impact of the case extended far beyond those directly involved. In 2003, the U.S. Congress passed the Sarah Law, establishing new protocols for monitoring homeschooled children in isolated rural areas. The anonymous medical data from the women, collected with their informed consent, significantly contributed to the understanding of severe inbreeding effects in humans. A longitudinal study at the University of Washington continues to generate scientific publications. In 2015, the Blackwood property was demolished by the state of Oregon. A small memorial now stands where the barn once was, a simple bronze plaque with the words, "To honor the resilience of the human spirit in the face of extreme cruelty." To remember that isolation should never replace community vigilance. Of the 7 women, 5 eventually established independent lives, though with varying needs for support. Rose and April, the most severely affected, remained in specialized care. Sarah became a respected activist for abuse victims and a symbol of resilience. "People often ask me how I survived those years in the barn," she said in a 2010 speech. "The truth is, I survived because I never knew there was an alternative. Now I know there was a whole world beyond those walls. My mission is to ensure no child ever grows up without knowing they are entitled to this world." The legacy of the Blackwood case remains a dark reminder of the extremes of human isolation and the abuse that can fester when communities lose touch with their most isolated members. It also stands as a testament to the extraordinary human capacity for recovery. If you have made it this far, it is because this story resonated with you. Leave a comment saying "I watched here" so I can get to know you and see who truly follows the channel. Don't forget to subscribe to learn about more real cases like this. Give your like to support our investigative work, and share this impactful story with those who value documentaries that reveal the darkest realities of the human condition.